So I'm very excited to introduce you today to the amazing Belinda Fettke. Thank you so much, Belinda, not so just for being here today, but also for being involved in the summit.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Tracy. I'm really, really excited to be part of your summit and to be online with so many amazing people. So it's a great feeling moving forward.
Fantastic. So can you share a little bit about you? I know a lot of people will have heard of you, but there may be some people here who are yet to hear your story. Is there a snapshot of Belinda Fettke we can hear about?
A snapshot of Belinda Fettke. I guess the reason I went into all of this low carbohydrate, healthy fat principles, the reason I found out about it was because I was diagnosed with cancer in the year 2000. And as a result of that, he kept trying to look for ways to improve his health. He was on chemotherapy for many, many years. And he was introduced to David Gillespie's Sweet Poison in the year 2011, 2012, I think. And thought, oh, what could a lawyer possibly know about sugar that I don't know? How could this be improving my health? And so he looked into it very seriously. And as a result of that, he reduced his sugar firstly, and then realizing that pasta and bread and all the carbs just become glucose in your blood system as soon as you ingest them. He looked into low carbohydrate way of eating, and it's really improved his health. So once he started seeing the results in his own health, he looked into it to potentially improve the health of his patients. Gary is an orthopedic surgeon, and while he doesn't see people necessarily for diabetes per se, he sees the end complications. And 20 years ago, he might have seen 1 or 2 people a year with diabetic complications requiring amputating of bits of toes or forefeet or even lower legs. In the last few years, it's grown to be a tsunami, and he's been seeing people every single week in his practice in northern Tasmania. And we're a small catchment area compared to a lot of other major centres. Gary, I think the catchment area is about 120,000 people. So to be seeing somebody every single week requiring some sort of operation is quite frightening. And so looking at the role of sugar and lowering carbohydrates for his patients as well and stabilising blood glucose levels was very, very exciting to him. So I think in my talk, I sort of say, you know, he was so excited to speak to the dietitians at the hospital and go, oh my gosh, you won't believe this. I've stumbled across this, and there's more and more evidence that I'm finding to see the health benefits of this. We could reverse type 2 diabetes and get rid of it in 2 years. Well, the dietitians weren't as excited as he was. And so instead of celebrating or talking to him, they decided to silence him and reported him to the medical board for being outside his scope of practice, talking about nutrition, despite the fact that he was improving their health. Gary actually had no patient complaint, and here he was from the dietitians being silenced from giving nutrition advice. So as a wife, just sitting there going, I can't believe it. I've seen Gary improve his health. I've seen what he's done in our community and heard about, you know, patients were talking about how excited they were saving their limbs and reducing their blood glucose levels and coming off medication. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Why is this happening? Gary was investigated for 2.5 years by the medical board. So I started researching. And as you know, Tracy, I have stumbled across a lot of vested interests, but also a religious ideology that's an anti-meat, has an anti-meat, anti-saturated fat, anti-protein, animal proteins, and going down this plant-based dietary guidelines, in fact, pushing towards a high-carb, low-fat diet. And understanding the influence of the vested interests, the religious ideology, shaping our dietary and health guidelines has been, for me, a fascinating study and understanding where all this is leading. But it has incredible ramifications. And so for 2 years, I didn't speak about my research. We were just presenting it to the medical board to say, hey, you know, you're investigating my husband for something that is actually outside your scope and potentially is being interfered with. And they refused to believe it. So after 2.5 years, Gary said, look, you've gathered enough evidence. This is really important. We need to talk about it, because it's the transparency for everybody else. So while these people, whether it's vested interests from the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the Dietitians Association of Australia, their corporate partnerships with these industries, or whether it's actually a religious ideology that's causing a bias, I think for people like you and I, for Gary especially, to understand how lowering carbohydrates, it's cereal for brekkie, isn't the most important thing, is just something that we needed to talk about. So it's a challenging topic, but I think the more you start to understand, you just go, oh, aha, that just makes sense. And so it's not being anti-religion, anti-vegan. I think I respect other people's belief systems. And so that's not my issue. The issue is imposing these beliefs and these rule books onto the general population when they don't understand where they're coming from, and potentially silencing doctors from being able to provide best practice. I don't think that's fair. So that's why I've gotten loud and why I support Gary. So that's where Belinda's come from.
Unbelievable. And, you know, to ask you now why you're so passionate about low carb, okay, where do you start? I mean, there's so much that's obviously come into, you know, what you and Gary have been through. And I will let everyone know that Belinda actually talked on my podcast early this year. And I'm going to put links to the 3-part chat that Belinda and I had, you know, so you can really understand Gary's story and Belinda's story. But how then are you going to put some of this together for the summit? So what's your topic for the summit? Because there must be just so much you can talk about, Belinda.
There's a lot I can talk about, but I've decided to use the title Nutrition Science, and science is in inverted commas. How did we get here? And I think leading up through a little bit of the history, well, I start with Gary's health journey and why an orthopedic surgeon decides to even think about nutrition and food as medicine. And then I'm going to link into the DAA corporate partnerships with the cereal industry specifically, but there's a lot of partnerships that they have, but the cereal industry specifically, leading on then to the vested interests and the ideology that have shaped our dietary guidelines. So going back into a little bit of history and coming back to where we are at this point in time. And from that, I'm leading into the branding that I've discovered around lifestyle medicine, exercise as medicine, and a collaboration between the two of them called the LMED collaboration, which is Lifestyle Medicine Education Collaborative. And this is something that I've found that the Seventh-day Adventist Church and Coca-Cola are working together on to create a medical curriculum that is a plant-based, a plant-based Garden of Eden, so biblical Garden of Eden diet, which is fruits, grains, nuts and seeds, and sort of pushing the exercise as medicine. It's okay, it's all people's fault if they're overweight. It's calories in, calories out, and a little bit of Coke's okay. So the plant-based Garden of Eden diet with a side of Coke. Now, we've seen what's happened with medical education and the demonizing of saturated fats for 50 years, since the 1970s. And this fear of fat has gone through so many generations almost. We're into the definitely second, if not almost into the third generation of medical students fearing fat. And now, if we take it this next step and they fear animal proteins as well, I'm very concerned, Gary's very concerned about the health outcomes that this will lead to. So again, it's about talking about transparency, it's about understanding where these rule books are coming from, and then being able to make an informed choice if you possibly can. And as there's more and more doctors, which I know you've got being able to speak on here, doctors, dietitians, health professionals, the more people we have who understand these benefits and can support us to make that choice. And whether that's vegan, vegetarian, omnivore, heading more towards a carnivorous diet, it's about people's health and taking them where they're at. So this is a really important thing, and understanding where the rule books are being written, I hope I can help people make those informed choices as to what's best for their health.
Fantastic, fascinating, and just stuff that everybody really needs to know. So I can't wait to listen. Can I just ask you a question around, you were talking about with obviously with Gary being an orthopedic surgeon, and diabetes, and because it's just one of the things that I don't think people really realise, that it is such a progressive, horrible disease, type 2 diabetes, obviously we're talking about here, and with the amputations and things like that. So what were you saying that the numbers 20 years ago, was it 20 years ago, that was like, was it just an old age, disease?
Yeah. 20 years ago, it was definitely a disease. Type 2 diabetes was a disease that people tended to get once they'd retired. The diet was starting to change. Polyunsaturated oils were coming through, more and more carbohydrates. And I show the food pyramid from 1992, where 6 to 11 serves of carbohydrates were recommended per day. And back then in 1992, one serve was 2 slices of bread, not 1 slice like it is now. So people were starting to eat more and more carbohydrates, base their meals on carbohydrates, and adding in the polyunsaturated oils to get rid of the saturated animal fat. And if you look at the health that's progressed from there, it's not good. So yes, diabetes type 2 was definitely a disease that came about sort of in retirement. It was an old age sort of thing. It just happened, and people weren't fearful of it. It was a slow progressive disease, and a lot of people would have died from heart attacks and a whole lot of other things, not from type 2 diabetes. Or it may have contributed to the heart disease and other things that we've found out since. But it wouldn't have been thought of as a real issue for the government and our health guidelines to have to be concerned about. As time's gone on, and Gary's seeing more and more people, as I say, every single week requiring some sort of amputation. So not just all the other people he was seeing with type 2 diabetes complications, and also type 1, but predominantly type 2 diabetes complications. Then you think, if we can improve the health outcomes for these people at younger and younger ages, like it's impacting workplaces now, it's impacting parents who are still looking after children. A case that Gary saw just 2 years ago before Christmas, and it was a young man in his 40s with 3 young children, and 2 of them came to the outpatients clinic and were playing on the floor, and Gary just went, oh my gosh, this man has already got issues with his eyes, with his kidneys, and I'm seeing him for ulcers on his feet that may not heal, and he could end up having to have amputations. And this is going to impact that family so greatly. And so against the determination that the medical board came down with, silencing him from talking about nutrition, he just said, I can't do this. So he said to this man, have you heard about low carbohydrate diets? Have you considered this in your management? And he looked at Gary as if he had 20 heads, not just 2 from Tassie. And he went off and he committed to this. He was written up in the notes as being someone who's non-compliant. He was having trouble with his work, staying in his job, because his blood glucose was going all over the place, and nobody was considering that it was that was causing his behavioural issues and mental state. They were just purely going, oh, he's just not compliant with his medical issues, not coming to all the appointments that he was meant to do, all sorts of things. And they were writing him off. And Gary, so 2 weeks later, he came back to Gary and he said, I can't believe, the first thing he said was my mental clarity. I can't believe I can actually start to think. And as he went on, another couple of weeks down the track, his ulcers, and they were at the beginning, they were starting to heal. And Gary, he was just so excited. He had his blood glucose starting to come under control for the first time. He'd had type 2 diabetes for 20 years. Type 1 diabetes for 20 years. He'd had it for 20 years, diabetes. And here he was developing these complications, and no one had mentioned low carb before to him. And I think when Gary saw that, he became even more determined to speak out and said, I'll risk my medical license if this is what it's going to take. And I'm really proud of him for not backing down. Of course, after we just kept sending more and more information to the medical board and challenging them on so many levels, and I went very, very loud, that finally after 4.5 years, they overturned their case, or it was thrown out, and everything was dropped. and Gary's now allowed that he actually got a written apology, and he's now allowed to talk about nutrition as he should be, as any doctor should be, as they can talk about smoking to a patient, as they can talk about exercise and movement and physical therapy. I mean, being a doctor should be about looking at a person holistically, not just their right big toe. So, you know, I think what Gary's been able to do in Australia, similarly to Tim Noakes in South Africa and many others around the world, they've changed the rules to allow doctors to be able to have these conversations. But as I say in my talk, well, if Gary is allowed to talk about this, why are the DA still protecting grains? You know, why is the peak body of nutrition still making the rules and calling out low carb as a fad diet? So I think it's really interesting, and I hope your the people who sign up for the conference and get to come along will just come away with a few questions. And as I mentioned to you before, Tracy, I'm very happy to do a Q&A and have a chat with people afterwards as well if they have questions.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, I did have one other question. Have you got time for one quick question just on your view, because you've lived this now, and after what you've been through with Gary, and you know, obviously low carb, you know, has helped with his cancer, put his cancer into remission and all of that. Yeah. What's your view on the common question I get all the time is it's just not sustainable?
I think if you've got a vested interest in your health, low carb is very, very sustainable. Gary has never stepped out. I mean, I think once at Christmas he had like a tiny, tiny sliver of a pudding that was happening at somebody's place that we went to. He's so invested because if he turns around and eats sugar and carbohydrates, his cancer will become active again. So again, for people who've got type 2 diabetes and they want to control their blood glucose, it's totally sustainable because you put yourself into a position where that's not what you want. Like this is your life. But I think what's really important for people to understand who might not have such a vested interest and they're wanting to do it to improve their health and to make, you know, I say their health retirement much more palatable. You know, looking at low carbohydrate, it's a really good way to think that it's like a best friend. And even if at times you might, you know, have, say, for some reason or whatever, you might have some higher carbohydrate meal if you go out somewhere, or, you know, we've gone out once or twice to a meal and they've had sugar in it, and Gary can tell afterwards. But I think don't panic, because when you go back to low carb, it just envelops you. You know, you have satiety, you have all of these good feelings that come back again that you don't need to fear. It's not like a punishment going, oh my gosh, you're so bad you didn't do it. It's like, oh my gosh, how much better do I feel when I am doing it? How much better do I feel when I'm eating low carbohydrate, healthy fat? I'm not calorie restricting. I'm not doing all those things. I'm improving my health and I feel good. And so if that's what you want to achieve, then it's totally sustainable.
Absolutely. What a gift to have you on board the summit. Thank you so much, Belinda. And yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to hear it and get the message even more out there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy. I really appreciate it.